Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this third edition of our webinar series on Indian foreign policy, people, power, and perspectives. I'm Jochen Luckschalter. I'm the director of the Heinrich Böll Foundation's New Delhi office, and I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of our organization. For those who are unfamiliar with us, we are a political foundation connected to the Green Party in Germany. The series, which is co-hosted with the Council on Strategic and Defense Research, CSDR, here in Delhi, aims to delve into the complexities of India's foreign policy as it asserts itself as a major global player. In this third session, we'll focus on India, Europe, and the geopolitics of space. The success of India's Chandrayaan-3 mission, which landed a rover on the moon in August 2023, has sparked significant international interest in India's space capabilities and geopolitical ambitions in this regard. As the strategic importance of space grows, for example, with more weapon systems relying on space technology, the geopolitical landscape of space is becoming increasingly competitive. While Russia, the US, and increasingly China are well-known players in space politics, India's and Europe's rising influence should not be underestimated or overlooked. There's also significant opportunities for collaboration between India and Europe, each bringing unique strengths to the table. Today's webinar will explore the development and current capabilities and future goals of India's space program within today's geopolitical context. And we'll also look at how India-EU cooperation could impact the future of space exploration, security, and global space governance. I'd like to thank CSDR for their ongoing partnership in this endeavor, and also a special note of appreciation to our colleagues at the Heinrich Böll Foundation European Union office for their invaluable help and support in organizing this event. And of course, a big thank you to our speakers for sharing their time and insights with us here today. With that, I will already hand over to Devika from CSDR and look forward to a engaging session. Thank you very much. Over to you, Devika. Thank you.
Thank you, Jochen. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Devika. I represent the New Delhi-based Council for Strategic and Defense Research, and I would like to welcome you all on behalf of CSDR. A quick, brief introduction to us. CSDR is a new age think tank committed to producing meaningful change, combining global and regional expertise to deliver tailored interventions rooted in rigorous research and experiential knowledge. Our expertise covers foreign policy, geopolitical risk, defense, geoeconomics, climate change, peace building, and tech policy, to name a few. And our regional expertise is in the Indian subcontinent, Eurasia, and the Indo-Pacific. We are delighted to be hosting this closed-door roundtable on India, Europe, and the geopolitics of space with HBS. And I thank Jochen and Shalini and the rest of the team for doing this with us. This is the third in our collaborative webinar series, Indian Foreign Policy, People, Power, and Perspectives. So to quickly kick things off, let me introduce our speakers very briefly. We have Dr. Susmita Mohanty, who is a spaceship designer, serial entrepreneur, and space diplomat. She's the Director General of Spaceport Sarabhai, or S2, India's first and only space think tank, which she co-founded in 2021. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Mohanty. We have Professor K.R. Sridharamurthy, who is currently advisor in the Chancellor's Advisory Board of Jain deemed to be University in Bangalore, and also an honorary director of the International Institute of Space Law. Thank you to Professor Murthy for joining us today. We also have, in a brief while joining us, Mr. Patrick Chotard-Moulin, who is the deputy head of the Space Division at the European External Action Service, and he has previously served over 15 years in the French Air Force. Finally, we have our expert moderator, Ambassador Rakesh Sood. Ambassador Sood is a former diplomat and served as India's first ambassador and permanent representative to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, and later as ambassador to Afghanistan, Nepal, and France. And at the Foreign Ministry, he set up the Disarmament and International Security Affairs Division and has formerly been Special Envoy of the Prime Minister for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. He's currently also a Distinguished Fellow at CSDR. Thank you for joining us, Ambassador Sood. Quickly, some housekeeping notes. As mentioned, I request our panelists to keep their opening remarks to 5 to 7 minutes. And post the opening session and the moderated discussion, we will open the floor to questions from our attendees. So audience, please use the Q&A box to raise your questions for the moderator's consideration. That's all from me. I will now hand over the proceedings to Ambassador Sood. Sir, over to you.
Thank you. Let me also add my word of thanks to the HBS and CSTR for organizing this, and also I'm grateful that both Sushmita and Sridhar were kind enough to accept my invitation to join our session. So let me just to set the ball rolling. I would sort of suggest that while we know about ISRO's story, ISRO's history, and things like that, and from its modest beginnings, the innovative approach, the programs that it launched, the INSAT series, and so on. But today we are now in a different age. Two things have happened as far as India's space program is concerned. One is that, if we think about it, from about 1990s, I would say, the space environment globally started changing, and India is no exception. I was reading somewhere that between 1950s and 1990, about 93% of all space launches were by the United States and the Soviet Union. You fast forward to 2020, and 90% of all space launches are by the private sector. I mean, that's a completely stupendous shift. In the last 5 years, something like 120, 130, I'm sure Sushmita and Sridhar will be able to correct me. There are now 130, 140 Indian startups in the space sector. And they're jostling for space, pardon the pun, with ISRO, whether it is in launches, whether it is in satellites, whether it is in services, whether it is in ground-based services, and so on. I mean, they're just revolutionizing space as we understand it. So we are no exception to the kind of democratization that has taken place. I'm told that today there are about 5,000 active satellites, or 5,500 active satellites orbiting. And there are plans by some of the private players that are entering the market of putting out another 40,000 satellites in the next 5 years. But what is that going to do to space? How is that going to impact everybody? More than 100 countries are operating at least one satellite each today. So there is an enormous amount of democratization that has taken place. At the same time, there is growing concern of a kind of militarization which has taken place in space, which was earlier just perhaps limited to big players like the United States, Soviet Union, and China. But today there are a number of countries that are setting up their defense space agencies and things like that, and India is no exception. So how does this impact space governance? And finally, any international regime, and I have dealt with a number of international regimes, whether in the space domain, in the biotech domain, in the nuclear domain, and so on. Any international regime requires two things: a convergence of views among the major powers of the day, and secondly, an ability to convince the rest of the world that this outcome of this convergence is something that is globally a positive development. It's a global public good. Now, today, you don't have that convergence of views among the major powers. So, can there be some kind of a global public good that can be developed by the medium powers, by the smaller players? Can they come together to create some kind of a regime to which willy-nilly, just by force of numbers, major powers will be obliged to accept as a norm, as a guidance? I don't know the answers to many of these things, but I'm quite confident that our experts should be able to throw some light on these these questions and look at prospects where the Europeans, EU, and India can come together. Now, I'm conscious of the fact that we are still missing our European participant. So I guess, but I think given the constraints of time, we will start off. So I think Sushmita, you're going first, isn't it? You're muted, I think.
Okay, yes, I'm happy to make my opening remarks if you'd like, Ambassador
Please,
Sood.
please.
Okay, so just quickly in a couple of sentences, I would like to give you a bit of my background so that it sets the context for what I'm about to say. I've been in the aerospace field, professionally speaking, for over a quarter of a century. I started off by doing a brief stint at NASA Johnson in 1997. And then I was with Boeing in Southern California. I worked for the space station program for about 3 years, after which I spent about 20 years in space entrepreneurship. So I co-founded 3 different companies, one of which was in Europe. It was called Liquifer. It's still around. It's in Vienna. It's 17 years old now. So I have a very good understanding of how the European space landscape is and how it works. I moved back to India in 2008. I started my third venture, Earth to Orbit. And starting 2021, I run a space think tank. So I think in my opening remarks, I'd like to give a brief understanding of where India stands, globally speaking. I would rank India in the top 5 spacefaring countries in the world when it comes to technological capabilities and budget. And once we launch humans into low Earth orbit, we will be in the top 4 because human space capability is limited to only 3 other countries for now. Since we are talking about budgets, I'd like to put things in perspective. So the European Space Agency budget for 2024 is about 7.8 billion euros. France Space Agency, which is CNES, their budget for 2024 is about 2.4 billion euros. And India's budget is about 1.5 billion US dollars, which is around 1.4 billion euros. And if you look at the other 2 European countries, which are significant when it comes to having space capabilities, Italy and Germany, Italy's budget is a little under 1 billion euros, if I'm not mistaken, and Germany is about close to 500 million. So this sort of gives you a framework to understand where India stands when we are talking about Indo-European space, generally speaking, the program and the capabilities that we have. I often get asked, why does India have a space program? Depending on who I'm talking to, I have a different answer. And since we are talking about geopolitics today, I think my answer would be, it's because space is geopolitics. For a subcontinent like India to have technological independence in being able to design, build, launch, and operate its own space assets, communication satellites, Earth observation satellites, navigation satellites, is not a luxury. It is a necessity. I'd also like to add that India happens to be one of the oldest, it happens to have one of the oldest space programs in the world because we did our first sounding rocket launch from Thumba in the south of India in November of 1963. ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organization, was formally incorporated in 1969, and I happened to have had the chance to grow up with the pioneers who started the program. So I'm almost as old, a little younger than the Indian space program. So I've seen it up close because my father was part of the early pioneers who started the program. I think that sort of sums up my opening statement, Ambassador Sood.
Thank you, Sushmita. Patrick, welcome to you. I'm glad you were finally able to join us. I trust you were able to get the gist of what Sushmita was saying in her opening statement. I had basically, in my opening remarks, I'd basically talked of the fact that how we are now in what I could call the second space age, which has seen a democratization of space and the coming into being of private sector. I mean, as I mentioned, I don't know how much you know, but in India, we have today, over the last 5 years, we've seen the growth of something like 130, 140 space startups. I'm sure something like that would also be happening in Europe. There are estimations about how the global space economy is set to grow rapidly. And what we would like to see is areas of potential cooperation between Europe and India, both on the governance side as well as on the development side. So thank you. And I think I can give you the floor right now for your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I hope that you can. We had a technical issue with the room, so we are now connected to a laptop. I hope that you can still hear us. So first of all, I would like to thank you very much, and I mean I concur to your assessment, and maybe I will bring a slightly different angle to it. And of course, I mean the first thing I would like to state is that we're very much looking forward to an increased cooperation with India on space between the EU and India. Maybe to start with, I would like to present a bit the EU, that the EU is a bit of a strange animal. You refer to some EU member states. The EU is what we call in the UN a RIO, a regional integration organization, and space within the EU is a shared competence, meaning that it's not the EU that decide on its own. It's something that member states can develop their own space program, and the EU can develop its own space program. Both are possible. And in fact, what the member states of the EU have, the choice that the member states of the EU have made is to leave the management of their major space infrastructure to the EU. We have, as you know, as part of the EU space program, different component. One is the Galileo, the global navigation satellite system, which has a level of performance which has nothing to envy to other global navigation satellite system. We have also Copernicus, an Earth observation system that is rendering services worldwide. And it was really a choice of our member states to leave it to the EU, together with the European Space Agency, to manage this base infrastructure. I didn't mention it, but we also have a space surveillance. We also have secure connectivity. A new program will come, which will provide the EU with a secure communication constellation. So all that is part of the EU space program. Maybe to say a word, because I'm not. I mean, in the EU, it's a bit of a complicated organization. I am serving the Special Envoy for Space, Marion van Delen, who unfortunately couldn't join today. And as such, the European External Action Service within the EU is a bit the beginning of a Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defense. So we really handle the security / diplomatic aspects of space. And maybe to come back to your introduction, Ambassador, the way we see it in the EU, indeed, that there is a big revolution ongoing. And for us, and I'm also coming from this security / diplomatic angle, the big revolution is that we now consider that space is no longer just a matter for business opportunities and industrial development and competitiveness. It remains very important to be competitive in space for the EU. But the big revolution is that we consider now space as a strategic domain. And what I mean by a strategic domain is that we are more and more aware of the risk we take if some essential space services that are vital for the functioning of our societies, of our economies, of our citizens, would be we would not have access to them. And regardless where they come from, they can come from the EU, they can come from our own industries, but they can also come from commercial operators, they can also come from third countries. And what we are really concerned with is what would happen if we don't have these services any longer. And that's what we addressed in the EU through a document which has been issued 2 years ago, the EU Space Strategy for Security and Defense, where we really want to address this what if something would happen to key space services that are necessary for the EU. Maybe, as you know, there are two risks that we contemplate. One is due to the proliferation of space activities, the risk related to the safety of space activities. We talk about the debris, we talk about long-term sustainability guidelines in the United Nations. We're also very interested in space traffic management. So we issued 2 years ago a joint communication proposing an EU approach to space traffic management, with the idea that there cannot be not even a continental approach to space traffic management. It's a global endeavor, and we were trying to propose what our regional approach would be, inviting other continents to propose their own approach to space traffic management. So that's one of the topic, not the one maybe for today. The other topic we are very much concerned with is the proliferation of threatening, aggressive behavior in outer space. There are a lot of actors, and it's space may look very big, but it's also very small at the same time. If something happened to key orbits, it will be mankind that will be affected. So we are very much in favor of a global governance of our space. We are very much working together with India and others towards prevention of an arms race in outer space. So that's what also we are very much involved with in the European Union. And maybe just to come back to this strategy, and the main axis of this strategy that I would invite you to read, it's a transparency and confidence building measure. It's widely accessible, and we think that first we need to converge on an awareness of all the space threats, looking at all the threats that can endanger the delivery of space services that are vital for our societies. We look also at ways to improve the resilience of our space program, and among the reflections that are ongoing in the EU, we would think of a space law precisely to regulate space operators operating in the EU or delivering services in the EU, addressing both the safety, the sustainability, and the environmental aspect of space activities. We also think of what would be a response of the EU together with member states, allies, and partners. Would some of our key services be endangered? And you know that we are not a military power, but we have some diplomatic tools and some economical tools that we could use as EU to deter irresponsible and aggressive behaviors and threats that we have witnessed recently. And last but not least, probably the most important aspect of our strategy is the partnership dimension, and that's where India and the relation between EU and India has its place. We really believe that we need to partner for responsible behaviors in outer space. I know that India is also very committed to that. The discussion we're having in the first committee of the United Nations General Assembly to really work on concrete measures. We all agree that we need to evolve the legal international framework of space activities, but it cannot be done in one go through a treaty that would solve all issues. So we really believe in concrete, pragmatic measures, and we would be very happy to work together with India to look at those and identify what we could do to really move in the direction of a space which would be safer, where even the security and defense aspects of it would be better regulated. Because the way it is right now, any defense activity in space could end up in an escalation that no one wants. So the idea would be really to work together to improve the way we operate in outer space through clear norms that we could all agree upon. I will stop there because I was very long, but it's just to give you an insight into what we are considering right now in the European Union.
Thank you, Patrick. I think thank you for that overview, and it raises a number of questions I was particularly struck when you said that EU now looks upon space as a strategic domain. So, in a sense that, as far as I recall earlier, it was seen more as a domain for civilian and scientific exploration. So, looking at it as a strategic domain, what are the additionalities? But we'll come to that during our conversation. Let me now give the floor to Professor Sridhar Murthy. Sridhar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador. So, at the outset, let me convey my thanks to both HBS and CSDR for this forum and inviting me for this. Ambassador Sood initially talked about the transforming scenario in space, particularly the private sector role, the issues relating to space governance, and also global public good. In fact, the space governance is closely linked to the global governance itself, as very well illustrated by the strategic role of space. As we know, space is a multi-objective domain. It caters to different objectives. That is the reason why different countries, even the new entrants, perceive space with different perspectives. As far as India is concerned, of course, from the very beginning, the outlook is somewhat holistic outlook on space. Initially, with the vision for using space for accelerating the national development issues, particularly the field of socio-economic development, use of space for education, communications, for managing natural resources, and so on. That has very well continued for a long time. But what distinguished India from many other space players has been the self-reliance mantra, which was initially followed, and till now, that is something which has given a totally different kind of outlook on space and also in building the capabilities. Well, this 5.5 decades of quest of India in space, which I was very fortunate to be part of from the initial stages for almost 3.5 decades, can be summarized in terms of, building autonomous access capabilities and building cost-effective systems. And what is different again is the user-driven approach. Particularly, we developed the space keeping in mind the application, the demands of the application. That made it very, very different in terms of, the flavor of the space program itself. Of course, space could give us the strategic capability and also scientific exploration. The basic seeking of knowledge was not totally ignored. We had, although in small measure, always there had been emphasis on building good scientific outlook through space activities. That is how later on, we could have missions for Chandrayaan, Mangalyaan, and so on, and very unique type of, endeavors. In all this, of course, initially, we had the great privilege of cooperation with, many major space agencies, and particularly, I would like to mention Europe. When I was in the initial stages of my employment in ISRO, I still remember receiving a kind of an open offer from the Area Development Program, which was very interesting. They offered a free ride for worthy payloads. So Indian Space Research Organization at that time took up the challenge, and we had the first geostationary satellite experimental satellite Apple, which in a way we can say was the vanguard of all our communication satellite programs. We also had many memorable cooperative endeavors with Europe, the Symphony Telecom experimental project, and even Dauphin sounding rocket, technology transfer from the Soothe Aviation in those days, and Centaur rocket launching by France for study of upper atmosphere from Tumba in India, and then the Vikas engine development with the SCP cooperation, and many such memorable endeavors, cooperative endeavors we can recall Europe had always had a special place in India, and of course this initial cooperation has also transformed into very interesting subsequent commercial relationships. India was one of the countries, in spite of being a spacefaring country, it has used Ariane rocket as a consistent customer. 21 satellites, if I recall correctly, of communications geostationary satellites have been launched by Ariane launchers. And we had also had very good cooperation in having joint missions with the French National Space Agency, for example, the Megatropics mission for studying of water cycle, the satellite Saral, which is again Argos and Altica, which are the payloads for data collection and ship tracking and so on. So we had a very fruitful cooperation over the years, and many more, I'm sure, are on the table for future. But in the current context, what could be our future vision, joint vision between Europe and India? What are the areas of synergy and where we differ, a clear understanding of what are our different approaches. These are important aspects in the present juncture. For this, of course, we need to understand what is a kind of change that is happening in India with respect to the space program that is going to be important. Is India's emphasis relating to socioeconomic applications of space is going to continue in a dominant way as in the past, or our outlook is going to include more urgent and different strategic objectives for space? These are the questions I think we could explore during this further. And certainly two areas which will be dominant, I think, in the years to come in India is the growth of private industry role, and definitely, the adding of new capabilities in the Indian space program to look at the urgent needs relating to the security and the space governance related issues. These are going to dominate apart from the commercial or economic objectives for the space program. Definitely, I look forward to very interesting discussion around this during the rest of the session.
Thank you, Sridhar. I think you've raised some very interesting points. But one of the things that I will come back to you will be that while you talked of Saral and Megatropic, and as a former Indian ambassador to France, I'm fully aware of the work that India and France, ISRO and CNES have done together, along with Arianespace as our launcher, as our preferred launcher. But then the question that arises, and let me pose this to Patrick, since Patrick also is now with the EU, but then has been a French Air Force aerospace officer. With individual countries in Europe, and this, Patrick, I'm sure, that our relationship with France has been perhaps the closest compared to any other European country in the area of space. But how does that translate? Because what we are looking at here is not individual relationships. I mean, ISRO has signed MOUs with more than 60 odd countries over the years. And France is one of the most active cooperative partners for us. So for that, we don't really need EU or any such thing. I mean, ISRO has that ability to pick up the phone, talk to people in France, and it's something that figures in high-level consultations all the time. But if we are looking at Europe, I mean, then I would like to ask you, wearing your present hat, because here you are not representing CNES, you are representing EU. So how does that so two questions. One is that, and second question that I'd like to ask you to come back is, when you say that EU considers space to be a strategic domain, so how does that shift your perspective? What are the additional roles, responsibilities, concerns that it raises? Because when it comes to defense applications, I mean, to the best of my knowledge, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I may be out of date. I mean, it is essentially individual EU members who develop their own defense capabilities, or are you developing some shared, domain awareness capabilities or whatever? But I leave it to you. So these are two questions that I'd like you to address.
Yes, thank you very much, Ambassador. Indeed, in fact, I never worked for CNES, and I'm an EU official now for 20 years, so I am not French anymore. But it's true that I know a bit my country. No, I mean, the evolution is twofold. I mean, the weight of the member states, and I mentioned it in my introduction. You take the example of the Galileo PRS, the Public Regulated Service of Galileo, which is an equivalent and has more or less the same capabilities as the US M code of GPS. It's a military signal. So we already have decided to pool some military capability from space at EU level. And we do it even more now. If you look at the secure communication facility, the IRIS Square, it means concretely that member states have decided not to rely on their national assets, but to pool in an EU-managed infrastructure a capability which could become vital to some of their military activities. So it's a choice which can be dictated by pragmatism because they cannot afford individually, or also because we fulfill the same goals. And what has happened, I'm sorry to get out of space, but what has happened with the invasion of Ukraine and so on has also been a wake-up call for, we see an alignment of the European position, and what is going on with the procurement of defense equipment. So that is happening for the first time ever. There will be a commissioner for defense industries in the commission. So that's a shift that you observe, which doesn't relate to space, but impacts space a lot, because a lot of key defense-related activities relate to space. In our division, we oversee the EU Satellite Center, which is a key geospatial intelligence capabilities space-related, and it is something which is very important because it allows the European Union to decide autonomously. You mentioned the word autonomy, which has been a driver for Indian space program for a while. The same logic applies to some individual member states, but applies to the EU as a whole. And that's something we of course, we talk about an acceptable level of European autonomy, but it is something which is very important. And to come back to the revolution that is ongoing for us, when the evolution, it's simply to acknowledge the dependence on space systems. So it's not only, and as I mentioned, about the competitiveness of our industry, our ability to be present in space and to be a spacefaring nation, or to keep being a spacefaring nation. It's a concern. If you look at the Draghi report that was issued recently by the former governor of the Central European Bank, sorry, the former Italian Prime Minister, I would know this. It's really about maintaining the competitiveness, but not only. We also have this idea that if we are that the space environment is being threatened. We saw a Russian ambassador threatening any commercial system supporting the effort in Ukraine. When we had an attack on one of the US commercial satellite operator at the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine, we had a full network of wind turbine in Germany, which went down. So the question we are asking ourselves is, what would be the consequences for us would space being targeted? And that doesn't relate directly to the development of a space program. It relates to the fact that most European citizens, in their smartphone, on their watch, and everywhere else, they rely on space services to a level that we don't even measure. So that is the other concern that we are confronted with. And for instance, the strategy that we discussed was proposed to the Council, which is the place where member states discuss topics, in the Foreign Affairs Council. So it means that it was an issue much more global than just the issue of competitiveness or industry. It was what would be the consequences for us as citizens, for us as societies, for all our policies, would something happen in space? And we cannot help thinking about this threat of a nuclear explosion in outer space. What would be the consequence? Would someone detonate a nuclear weapon in outer space? So that is the kind of evolution that we are contemplating also in the EU, of thinking space as a strategic domain and not only as an area, as a sector of competitiveness like cars or aviation or other industries, but really something which is so important that we cannot afford not managing our level of dependence.
Ambassador Sood, can I come in here for a bit?
Sure.
So Patrick, since we're talking a little bit about the strategic and defense angle for space, I think one of the things that those of us in the space industry that are following things at a geopolitical level can't ignore the fact that the private players, such as, say, for example, SpaceX, which now operates its Starlink fleet of satellites, given the nature of Musk's ambitions, not only did he buy Twitter, but he also sent Starlink terminals to Ukraine, and I believe he also sent terminals during the protests that happened in Iran earlier this year. So I think what I'm trying to say here is we're seeing the rise of private space companies, and the rise has been stellar in the last decade or 2 decades. And there are no laws as such which can prevent private companies to interfere in sovereign affairs of countries. And any billionaire, whether it's Musk or anyone else, quite naturally has an inclination for empire building. So I think that's a provocative point. I'll love to have Patrick respond to. How does EU see Musk playing out in the geopolitical landscape? And the other thing I would like to add to the discussion, again, it's a provocation, but having worked in the United States for almost 12 years with NASA, with Boeing, and having had a company in Vienna for the last 17 years, I think what I've observed is the European Space Agency often piggybacks onto NASA decisions to a point where it could be detrimental for Europe. I can give you a real example. So when I was with Boeing in Southern California, there was something called a crew return vehicle. It was, think of it like a human space ferry, which, like the Soyuz, would have stayed docked to the space station at all times and could have been used, for example, in the recent debacle that happened with Starliner. The CRV program was very mature. I mean, the crew return vehicle, which was a collaboration between France and NASA, was already in the advanced flight stages when NASA dropped the program entirely. And that's something stayed with me because I spent about 15 years in human space exploration. And the fact that Europe, as a collective entity, doesn't have independent access, human ferry to low Earth orbit, to me is quite disappointing. I think France at one point was talking about Hermes. The Italians were also interested in building a human space ferry to low Earth orbit, but none of it materialized, partly because of the consensus process, the way things work in Europe, but also partly because I think Europe overly relies on the United States to lead. So I think I'll leave those two provocations for Patrick to respond and see what his thoughts are on the matter.
And Patrick, you can think about, is there a European Elon Musk on the horizon that you would like to identify?
Well, actually, we are trying to convince Louis Vuitton, but it seems not to work. No, I'm joking. No, I mean, it's funny what you say, because when we when we went to the State Department to present the space traffic management, the answer I get from my colleagues that, well, we have more of a problem of space billionaire management than space traffic management, obviously. But I mean, no, I mean, I'm not sure at the same time, and to provoke as well, that the EU is the best friend of Elon Musk. He's not only active in space, as you well know, he's active also on Twitter, he's active on social media, and let's say that he doesn't want the EU regulatory approach. And me personally, I like very much the EU regulatory approach, which can impose to a complete continent and to any third country operators that want to operate in this continent a certain number of known rules. And we have been pioneering a number of things in the EU. For instance, the data protection regime. The first company that implemented the data protection regime was Google.
Yeah, I followed that bit of the news. Yes, which is great.
It's just to tell you that I don't want to preempt what the future space law, which is not in my hand, is in the hand of the Commission, will be. But let's say that if they manage, it will change things, including for the third country operators. And I recall the fines that were given to Apple and other GAFAMs for not putting the right socket on their mobile phones. So we are a regulatory power. I mean, not very much in line with some different sort, but at least the EU has this power to regulate. We are not doing it in space yet, but we'll see. And that's maybe something to be looked into. On the space agency, I mean, space is complicated in Europe. The European Space Agency is not an EU agency. So the choice made, regarding human space flights, the EU doesn't have any activities on human space flight. So what we want to do as EU is to keep an acceptable level of European autonomy, but we are not into exploration. We are not into human space flight. Member states, if they want to do that, for the time being, they will do it in ESA. So, and I like to think that the EU is very much like India. So we focus on how space can best serve our citizens. And on that front, yes, the question of an acceptable level of European autonomy is being discussed. We simply cannot afford to compete with someone that owns half of the satellite in the world. There are also regulation in the US that applies, but what we can do is make sure that we preserve the core elements that we deem necessary for our services, and that in that spirit that you can, for instance, contemplate the IRIS² constellation. It's a constellation which is only aimed at the governmental communication, on which a European operator can piggyback. That is a discussion ongoing right now, but it's much less satellite than Elon Musk. But that's what we need for our key core European activities to be sustained without depending on a third party. So that's a bit the same philosophy as what I think the Indian space program is about.
Thank you, Patrick. If I may just ask you one more question. I mean, Copernicus is your Earth observation satellite, right?
Yeah.
So, and it provides imagery at what resolution?
Well, no, not really. You should not depict Copernicus as an Earth observation satellite, because there are plenty of satellites in Copernicus. And it's not so much a matter of resolution, because they vary from one mission to the next. Sometimes it's a kilometer resolution, but a kilometer resolution with a lot of spectral bands. It's a program which aims at operating its own satellites. We have EU own satellite called the Sentinels, but much wider than that. In fact, we pool any private operator, and there are a lot of contributing missions to Copernicus, and it's an instrument. There are even in situ measurements in Copernicus, so we also use a ground-based sensor, and the idea is to have an observatory on the Earth, mainly space-based. But it's not only a space program with satellites. It's more than that. It's about service delivery.
No, my question, what I was leading to is that is all the information and data that is generated out of Copernicus publicly available, or is there material which is classified and meant only for your members' defense agency needs?
No, for the moment, Copernicus is mainly aimed at environmental, and there are some security services in Copernicus, but they are more for, let's say, police, border guards. There is a cooperation with Frontex, for instance, our border guard agency, but it's not military use. Very limited military use of Copernicus.
Sridhar, you wanted to come in, please.
I see three types of governance issues when it comes to the space. One is the type of issues where we need binding rules, especially where actions of one actor can endanger the space activities in a major way, like the issues relating to space environment and so on. Unfortunately, there are many such areas where, we are not able to progress further. There has been a stalemate when it comes to the multilateral agreements are concerned. What is happening, on the other hand, is national laws are coming and they are, taking over. That is the will of, a few is imposed on everyone. So this raises the basic governance question. What will be the opportunities for the newcomers who come? The second issue is where there is a need for rules of the road. Avoiding interference and so on. This is there is a flexibility for everyone to live together, and we agree to follow certain rules of the road. Space traffic management is one area I think we need to make rapid progress. The third is, of course, another area where space provides plenty of opportunity to have the freedom of operation, because it may not affect the others, but can give a lot of opportunity for cooperation and all that. So with these perspectives in mind, I see a lot of opportunities with the experience we had gone through in India in cooperating with Europe, several space agencies, space industries in Europe and so on. At least for the future goals that India is looking forward to in space, I see a number of areas where we can work together, probably explore further cooperation, strong cooperation. These relate to, for example, environment monitoring and climate action related aspects, where we could think of some joint missions and data exchange and the applications development and so on. There could be a scope for collaborative projects, and there could be cooperation in fields like disaster management. Then there is a wide area, particularly in relation to the security applications of space. I do not know, Mr. Patrick can respond, because of the transatlantic cooperation or ESA's own priorities and geopolitical aspirations relating to the cooperation, whether it is practical to develop a strong cooperation in the field of space security. And of course, it also depends on Indian side also in this area. Space situational awareness is another area where I think India and Europe can come together. Then there is also possibilities for industrial collaboration. India is very strong in information related technologies, and particularly now the value chains are transforming. The GIS, machine learning, and so on, and visualization related tools. These are transforming the value chains, and space applications are going through metamorphosis. So the possibilities for industrial collaboration, where each player can come together and then bring in synergy, technology development partnership, policy coordination, complementary missions. So there are a number of many protos for this area. These modes have been already tried, and we have good understanding. To give you an example, when I was pursuing commercial space activities, we could build a common team with Astrium between a company in India, ISRO's company, and Astrium. We could develop a very good result in terms of producing, state-of-art satellites and, providing it to the customer. So these type of models have not taken off to their full potential, although, we demonstrated many of this. So in light of the governance issues we have today, we need to see which areas really, we can work together to take the cooperation between EU and India to the next level.
Ambassador Sood, can I add an idea from my side regarding cooperation between EU and India?
Yes, please go ahead.
So since we are talking about the EU, there's something called the Horizon 2020 Research Framework, which is an excellent program that the EU, or rather the European Commission, allocates anywhere from 60 to 80 billion euros every couple of years. And you can apply any research institution, any company, any university can apply for a grant to the H2020 program. And the size of the grants is significant. My Vienna company has in the past been awarded grants in a consortium format of up to 3 to 4 million euros to not only design space habitation systems, transportation systems, but to also build prototypes and test them. So I think since we are talking about the emerging space startup landscape, and now both several European countries and India have a very, very good space startup ecosystem, I think EU and India should also explore the possibility of opening up the Horizon 2020 program in part, where Indian space startups could also apply for grants in consortia format, in collaboration with European companies and European research organizations. I think that hasn't happened yet. There have been some open calls where international participants are allowed. But I think it could be taken up as a matter of strategic alignment between the two sides.
So, Sushmita, if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that Horizon 2020 currently is open only to European companies. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so your Vienna-based company could apply for it.
That's correct. And I think it would be wonderful if some of the Indian startups could partner with their European counterparts, EU counterparts, and also apply for grants.
I think that's a fantastic idea. I mean, I wish this should have come up before the last India-EU summit, but maybe, Patrick, you can push it and see whether this is possible within the Horizon 2020 framework.
I mean, yeah, if I may, I am not very comfortable to talk about that because this is really managed by. I am not part of the. I'm not this part of the commission. I would say it's our colleagues from DG DEFI. But all what you mentioned.
It is your colleague from
DG, from the Directorate General for Defense and Space Industry. We are the External Action Service and the management of the grants. We have other services of the Commission that are managing both the H2020 at large, which is a 80 billion euro program total. But within this 80 billion, there is a space part which is managed by the Directorate General managing the space program to ensure the consistency.
So that is, well, we'll take it up with him. DG, what? With
DEFI,
Director General?
Defense in Space. DG,
Defense
Industry and Space.
Okay.
So it is a service of the Commission that oversees these aspects. And maybe ambassadors to respond to all what has been said, which is perfectly right. The difficulty I see is that there are so many venues regarding a possible cooperation between space between the EU and India that it calls for a structure, what we call a structured dialogue, that we need to align all these ministries, all these actors, so that we can have a broad picture of the cooperation. That's what we would like to establish with you. We have that with a number of partners. We usually do that together with our Commission colleagues of DG DEFI. So because we precisely need to address all the industrial aspects, all the space program aspects, all the research and development aspects, along with the diplomatic aspects, the security aspects. So we usually on the EU side do it together, hand in hand with our colleagues from Commission, and we have that with a number of third countries. And I think that would be a fantastic opportunity to initiate such a discussion on space with you to address all the various aspects of space that we have touched upon today. I mean,
so, but which is your budget head under which you can do what Sushmita was suggesting?
I mean, that's to be very clear with you. I have empty. I mean, working for the External Action Service, I am as poor as the Indian MFA can be. I don't know if you have a rich MFA.
No,
so the money is mainly with the European Commission to propose, and for the European Parliament and the member states in the Council to agree upon.
So then,
we are not managing budgets. The budgets are managed by the Commission. That's why we do this outreach together with the Commission to cover both aspects.
So how do we have this structured dialogue that you suggested? I mean, we already have.
It's something that we could initiate, for instance, as part of our EU-India dialogue. If we want to make a focus on space, it could be seen as a byproduct of top-level political dialogues that we have between the EU and India.
All right. Thank you. Well, thank you, Sushmita. I think I've made a note of it. I talked to some people here in the Foreign Ministry, and I'm sure you can ginger up people in space.
Oh, yes. Absolutely.
To say that, look, I mean, this is something. But give me an idea, Patrick, while before we open up to other questions. I mean, how is the space startup scene in Europe? Just briefly.
They are vital. We miss. I'm not politically correct, but sometimes we wonder whether we have not missed a bit the new space revolution. So we very much value startups. To give you a very concrete example, you mentioned the H2020 program. There is an obligation to allocate a certain percentage and not neglectable to the startups to avoid that all the big companies that have all the consulting companies to file the request and so on. There is a part of the money which has to go to startups. The Airbus, Ariane, the big companies, Thales, cannot get that. That has to go to startups. Okay. So we have a lot of our programs, and I'm not the expert, it's more my Commission colleagues, but they dedicate a lot of activities to funding startups, using all possible instruments to develop innovative startup in Europe, and we see results already of these developments.
Right. Okay. I have a question here in the chat box, which I'm going to pose to my Indian panelists, because it says the question is, what kind of a private sector ecosystem is evolving in India? Are we going to get a Musk? Somebody is planning an empire like Elon Musk. I mean, what kind of governance or policy environment would the Indian private sector wish for? And would any of you, Sridhar or Sushmita, Sridhar, perhaps you can come in first because you've been with ISRO in the past, and then Sushmita, you can add in terms of what you would like as an entrepreneur.
Absolutely. Professor Murthy, please go first.
Yeah, as I see it, still, although we have close to 200, startups, that was a kind of, number I could see from various reports. Still, they were all, all on a scale which is much smaller. It is an innovative way in which, the space activities are spreading to small players. We welcome that. But to think of, an entrepreneur coming up on the scale of Elon Musk, probably, it needs greater, confidence on the part of, large players, large industrial players who are in other areas. Probably one of the key point that is still in the minds of, many of the entrepreneurs as I talk to them And also, some of the industries who are involved in the field of space activity, they still feel that the market is limited. Once the market is able to sustain large amount of activities, like if India expands its activities with a strategic vision, we need a big vision in terms of the number of launches, the size of launches, and so on, and also massive increase in the infrastructure, communications, and the internet distribution infrastructure, and so on, which is quite possible for space given the size of population and growing economy of India, and so on. So it is just to think of even 0.05% of a 10 trillion economy which India is going to achieve in some time in future. That is a huge amount of money for public investment. With that public investment and the opportunities that will be available for private sector, certainly I'm sure that many of the Indian industries, large industries, would jump in, and we can definitely see that kind of a prospect. But I think we have to wait for some more time. That is my humble feeling. But right now, I think whoever has come into the market, we need to carefully craft our policies and strategies to ensure sustainability, to give opportunities, to promote an ecosystem for innovation in the country. This is the need of the hour as far as the entrepreneurship is concerned. Certainly, whoever has come into the entrepreneurship drive in the field of space, to the best extent possible, we need to create market opportunities for them. And certainly, I think we can see a big growth in the years to come.
Sushmita,
Okay,
you want to indicate how you're going to become India's Elon Musk?
I think we don't need an Elon Musk, to be honest. I
Okay.
think the kind of rogue behavior that's on display, I think both EU and India can do without a Musk. But I think what we're trying to say here is, how can the Indian ecosystem ensure that we can go from being an advanced spacefaring country, a very accomplished government space program, to becoming a developed space economy? What I mean by that is, I mean, there are different estimates that you can find out there. There's a McKinsey report saying that the space economy will become 1.3 trillion by 2035 or so. There are reports which will tell you that the global space revenue in the civilian sector, not in the defense, is roughly about $400 billion US dollars. So India has a very small, a very modest chunk of that $400 billion pie. We are just 2% when it comes to a space economy, in the global context. And I think the reason I had been pushing for India to liberalize its space economy ever since I returned to India in 2008 was for this very particular reason, that we need to have the right kind of regulatory landscape, the right kind of funding landscape, and also the legislation to go with it, to make sure that Indian companies can become internationally competitive and become part of the international space marketplace. So in 2020, when the government announced its intent to, introduce some space reforms, to start liberalizing the space economy, to start encouraging startups, I think you can see that between 2020 and now, there has been this sudden explosion of the number of startups that we have that are, now incorporated as startups, of which right here in Bangalore, we have about 12 very mature. I mean, there are more than 200 startups that are incorporated, if you look at the incorporation records. But let's say there are at least 12 what I would call technologically mature startups. They are building and launching satellites. They are already sort of meeting their milestones in building new rockets. They are into nanotechnology, green propulsion, so all kinds of cutting edge stuff. And we are talking about the new space economy, which I think for those of you who are listening and are not aware is a little different from what we refer to as the old space companies. By old space, we mean legacy companies. In India, it could be a Larsen and Toubro, it could be a Godrej and Boyce. In the US, it could be a Boeing or a Northrop Grumman or a Lockheed Martin. So I think what we are talking about here is India now has the intent. They've set up a regulator and a promoter that will enable or facilitate this transition to letting the new space sector flourish. We do have a space policy now, officially. But what we are really now pushing for is for the country to have legislation, a national legislation to go with the space policy. We've also seen that the government has announced FDI reform. They have liberalized foreign direct investment into the space sector. But I don't think foreign investors would be as interested unless the country has a national legislation and also addresses the fact that we don't have an evolved space insurance landscape, which is also very important for foreign investors to come in. So I think we are on our way, Ambassador Sood, and we need some of these other big, important sort of parts of the ecosystem to fall into place, including a national space law.
Thank you. There is another question that I can see from the box asking as to, since space can be used for espionage and spying, as for example, when the US used its Lacrosse and K-12 satellites to monitor Pokhran nuclear tests, shouldn't there be a common framework? Well, I mean, I can answer this very clearly because espionage is seen as a legitimate activity. So therefore, you will not have a common framework. I mean, countries accept that espionage and satellite monitoring in that sense is a legitimate activity. However, there's another question that I can see here for Patrick. It says, Airbus has already collaborated with the Indian government on multiple projects like antenna test range facility, the Trishna satellite, and connected intelligence projects. Can we anticipate a partnership between Airbus and Indian space startups for a venture akin to Boeing's collaboration with NASA on the Starliner project? I mean, I don't know, but I mean, Boeing is, as Sushmita just said, I mean, Boeing is not a startup today. Boeing has been in the business for decades and decades. So that would be more if ISRO went into some kind of a venture with HAL or L&T or things like that, I would think. There's another question.
I'd like to add something there, and that is, the Indo-French cooperation really began with the rocket engines. And because of the Musk factor, because of SpaceX being able to offer launches at about $6,500 per kilogram, which is the cheapest in the world, the Ariane guys and even ISRO, which offers launches on the PSLV for commercial launches, now they're starting to put their heads together and see how to bring back this cooperation between India and France in the world of propulsion and reusable launch vehicles and all of those future generation launch vehicles, which in my view is wonderful news. And I think we'll have to thank Musk for that because, he's made it so competitive. But anyway, I think Airbus, I don't know what collaborations are being discussed, but I have heard that India and France are now going to work in the LV launch vehicle sector a lot more actively because of the international competition that we're seeing.
Yeah, also because India is now a member of the MTCR as well, so that makes things a little easier.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yes, that's where I wanted to go. I mean, the problem is that you look at space. Space is at the crossroad of many strategic discussion. Nuclear invited itself recently from another angle, but let's be honest. A space launcher most of the time is also a ballistic missile launcher, and so the question the reason why you go into space are different. And Elon Musk never developed SpaceX to become a ballistic missile, but you have a lot of risks associated to this development. We are very mindful of those. So it's important to look at all the different reasons we have to go into space and see how it works. I mean, at least for the European Union, the big companies like Airbus and others are also very much into the hand of our governments, of member states, and they also do different things. So we at EU level, we are mainly focused at the program, but we don't have really control of other European industrial policies. I mean, the national champions are very much in the hands of the respective member states.
Patrick, there is also another question. Perhaps you can give some assessment on that. How does Europe, I mean, it says, how do Europe and India view China's rising capabilities in the space domain? What are your threat perceptions, if any? So why don't you take the Europe part of it, and then maybe I can ask one of our Indian panelists to respond on that. I mean, how do you look at China's growing space capabilities, particularly in the strategic domain? And do you perceive any threat perceptions from it?
It's difficult for me to answer this question because it's not space related per se. China is showing great capabilities in outer space, some of which are worrying as well because again, everything we do in outer space, and that's also one of the things I didn't mention, but why we believe in behaviors and not in weapons so much, except for some weapons of mass destruction, is because anything you do in space potentially could be weaponized. So it's true also for China, and it's true that their capabilities are impressive. So voila, but then that then relates to the overall perception of the EU-China relationship, and I'm not qualified to address that. But let's say that the space is the declination of the overall EU-China threat perception and relationship, which is a complex matter.
Okay.
Ambassador Sood, can I just add my 2 cents
Sure.
here? So I will, again, like Patrick said, I mean, I'll also have to put a disclaimer here. So what I'm about to say is entirely my personal view. I definitely don't have insight into how the government looks at China's developing space capabilities. I personally think in the last quarter of a century, since I started working in the industry, China has definitively become one of the space superpowers. If you look at the number of launches that China does annually, if you look at who has been to the moon 7 times already, successfully, consecutively, there's only one country, China, who has brought back lunar samples in this past decade, not once, but twice. It's only China. The last time the US landed on the moon was in as in NASA landed on the moon was in 1972, and the last time the Russians successfully landed was in 1976. So I think China as a space power is, it's not even debatable anymore. I think they've arrived on the scene. They've been to Mars. They've sort of, now the way China is pursuing not just its fleet of satellites, its fleet of rockets, but also its human exploration program. They've had an independent human exploration program for over 15 years now. And I think China, like India, again, this is my perspective, it's not an official government perspective, has taken a very pragmatic approach to their space program. If you look at the continuity they've had with any of their roadmaps, it's quite staggering and quite impressive. So I think what I'm trying to say here is China is without doubt on par, or even it has exceeded on some fronts as far as the US-China space graph is concerned.
If I may just add one point on China, I would not, and maybe I'm talking to, I would ask India, but the feeling I have when I compare is that there is an element of pride in the Chinese space program with the human spaceflight dimension, which is also very much of a domestic policy issue, where I sometimes, and I talk under the control, and maybe it could be even a question, where India seems to me much more focused at using space for utilitarian really at the service of the policies in a more, I would say, maybe pragmatic way. But I don't know. It's for you to. If I compare the two programs, sometimes I have the feeling that at least there are some exploration programs in India as well, but they are not as advanced and maybe not as paramount compared to the historical goals of India, which were to benefit agriculture, to help India, to help sustain India's development. But I'm just wondering, it's more of a question.
Well, I think you're right, Patrick, but I have a last question. I think we are coming to the close of our time, but I have a very easy question for Professor Sridhar Murthy. Sridhar, you talked about the fact of governance, and you said we need binding obligations, rules of the road, and space traffic management and things like that. So I want to ask you, how do you get binding obligations? I mean, in the past, you know, you you and your seniors and juniors, you people sat together in COPUOS, the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and you negotiated treaties, and you reached an agreement, and it was all done between governments. So you had the US government, the French government, the Chinese government, the Soviet government, Indian government, etc., all sitting together in COPUOS and negotiating. Now, today, the biggest satellite owner is Elon Musk. You don't really have a place for SpaceX to sit in that, because these negotiations are still done by governments. So how do you bring about binding obligations when more and more space activities are going to be put in the private sector domain? Will the intergovernmental negotiating mechanisms still function? I mean, this is a bigger question than just space, because it is there for other domains as well. But for space, it is particularly important because I think that the revolution in space that has taken place, or the second space age, has left. Today, if India is looking at a $9 billion space economy, as Sushmita said, and the ISRO budget is just what it is, 1.5 billion. So more and more as time goes by, more and more of the space economy is going to come from private sector, as it is happening in other parts of the world, except maybe China. But I pose this last question. I mean, Sridhar, you take it on first, and then the others can contribute.
Yeah, it may look almost impossible, but your profession has taught me never to lose hope. Okay. Having said that, we need to include the private sector as stakeholders, and let us not also forget the international space law puts the onus on the governments to oversee the role of the private sectors, private entities who are under their jurisdiction. This is still a valid legal provision. So I think there is a need for at least seriously trying some areas binding agreement. The world cannot simply live with a situation where you see a worsening environment and still you lose hope and do nothing. I think that is not a pragmatic approach. And I still believe that it should be possible for the governments, provided they see the common threat. But today, this is not being possible because of the divergence of interests. There is no, you see, common interest that is prevalent, and still, we have a few dominant players. That's why this situation is prevailing. But definitely, I think there is a need for, at least in some areas, we need binding rules. And some areas, we can have rules of the road. This is quite possible, and we need to mount the cooperative approach for this.
Thank you. Would any of the others like to chip in on this?
I
Patrick?
think it's a difficult question, to be honest. I think the current intergovernmental framework is falling way short of reining in these powerful monopolistic entities that are taking over a large chunk of low Earth orbit and, in the future, probably, beyond that. So I don't know what the answer is, to be honest, but it's a very important question that needs to be addressed.
Patrick, any thoughts?
I mean, I was just thinking loud, but I think that it's an issue of how we foresee a global governance. If you look at the way the European Union works, we have different layers of governing. The lobbying power of the non-governmental organization or they are there in COPUOS, and I talk under the control of the colleagues that know better. But there is a place where where the industry, where the different groups can sit above behind the government. So it's necessary that the final decision making stays with the government. But the idea is to open up this international governance more and more to the private sector and to the various stakeholders, so that they can address their governments, but also the international community as a whole. And I think that all the stakes that are taking place right now in the UN, and not only in space, for climate change, for every big topic that we are confronted with, we try to evolve the governance so that we can to listen to those who maybe are not sufficiently listened to by their own governments.
Thank you. I think this is going to be one of the big challenges because, as you get these large companies, as Sushmita said, companies like SpaceX or, other big, large companies, I don't think they're going to be content sitting behind the country's flag only. Because they see themselves as global players, they would like to have a different kind of an approach. But at the same time, I mean, we are still, when we negotiate treaties, agreements, which are legally binding, we negotiate them as representatives of sovereign states. And that is why it brings me to Sushmita's point where she said in India, we are waiting for a space law. Because it is something like that if India becomes party to something, then every Indian company is expected to adhere to that law. It becomes part of India's national law. And that only underlines the need for space legislation. But I think because that means that company, if it is registered in India, is under Indian jurisdiction and control. So therefore, it has to adhere to the international obligations that India has undertaken. For example, I mean, India is a party, let's say, to the Chemical Weapons Convention. India has undertaken not to produce or export chemical weapons. Now, you can't have a country coming in quietly to some chemical industry owner and saying, okay, please produce this for me. That fellow will be violating Indian law, apart from first and foremost. So therefore, that company would be liable to Indian prosecution under Indian law because India is a party to the Chemical Weapons Convention. So I think so far that's there, but how we deal with this, particularly in today's age of geopolitical rivalries, is going to be something that is going to be difficult. But all that remains for me is to thank you, Patrick. I'm glad you were able to overcome your technical challenges and join us. Thank you, Sridhar, and thank you, Sushmita, for a very, very engaging conversation. Devika, over to you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you to all our panelists for joining us today and to our attendees as well. I think it has been a vastly interesting conversation and has, I think, revealed the level of interest in India's own burgeoning space sector in the ground realities of Europe's landscape and proven the space domain ripe with opportunities for the EU-India bilateral. Thank you, HPS, for doing this with us. We will be back in November with the fourth and the final in the ongoing HPS CSGR webinar series, where we will be exploring the implications of the US elections on India-Europe ties. So once again, thanks to all our panelists. Thanks to Ambassador Sood for an expertly moderated discussion. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.